Hello, this is Mark Unkefer, Director of the Fiber Optic Sensing Association, FOSA, and welcome to our January webinar. We're very pleased to have somewhat of a departure from our normal practice, which is to have more company-specific webinars. This one will feature the work product of our Technology Committee, chaired by Chris Minto, and we're pleased to focus on their work that they've done on advancing pipeline safety and have a kind of general overview, including technologies from a variety of companies. Leading off our webinar, we will have Mike Hines, who is the chairman of FOSA, who will do a more detailed introduction. Mike?
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. My name is Mike Hines. I'm the 2018 chair for the Fiber Optic Sensing Association, or FOSA. Before we get started today with today's session, I'll take just a few minutes to explain a bit about FOSA, who we are, and what we strive to achieve. FOSA originated in May of 2017. It's comprised of member companies who are active in the markets for distributed fiber optic sensing. With expertise in temperature, strain, and acoustics, the members collaborate to provide educational resources for the public. We also serve to effect legislative changes that enable industries to benefit from the unique attributes that fiber optic sensing offers. Doing so enhances safety, productivity, and security in numerous industrial systems like the pipelines that we'll discuss today. For those who are new to FOSA, we encourage you to check out our website. It's fiberopticsensing.org. Feel free to come to us with any questions you may have, and of course, we hope you'll consider joining our team to help FOSA shape the future of fiber optic sensing across many industries, including your own. For today's webinar, our main presenter is Dr. Chris Minto. He's the FOSA Technology Committee Chairman. Chris will give us a view to the key technologies of DFOS, distributed fiber optic sensing, covering important use cases that help explain how the technologies work, how they're deployed, and how they provide benefit to users. Chris, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Mike. Yes, hi everybody. Thank you very much for giving up your valuable time to attend today. As Mark has said, this is quite a unique departure for FOSA in terms of providing a webinar that truly reaches across the capabilities of all of our members. So the Technology Committee was very pleased to put together the presentation that you're going to see today. I hope you're going to enjoy it. I think we have a lot to say about how fiber optic sensing can help with pipeline safety, and I think you'll find it quite informative. Back to you, Mike.
Great, thank you, Chris. So we touched on what FOSA is. Chris, if you could advance to the next slide, we can go into just an overview of what the webinar will contain. So there's an introduction to FOSA, which you've basically already heard. How can fiber optic sensing help improve pipeline safety? That's a fairly major topic across the globe these days, and we'll try to touch on some of the benefits and attributes of distributed fiber optic sensing. How fiber optic sensing can deliver actionable data. If you're operating a pipeline, how do you actually make decisions? There's a little background noise there, if you can go on mute. Also outline how fiber optic sensing can be implemented. How do we actually deploy the technologies and install them and begin to use them? And then at the end, we'll summarize the benefits that can be provided if you consider using distributed fiber optic sensing as a means to monitor. Okay, so now we'll get into an introduction about the sensing itself, particularly for those who are unfamiliar with it. Chris, if you can just tab to the next slide. So this particular slide shows three icons that I think we'll repeat throughout the presentation. Basically, we're looking at temperature sensing, vibration sensing in an acoustic format, and strain sensing. So you'll see these icons pop up when we're discussing those relevant topics. What can it be used for? Essentially, it's a technology that can help monitor assets like pipelines and many others, but today we're here to talk about pipelines. It gives you the ability to monitor 24/7 over very long continuous lengths. So the phrase distributed is important. What actually happens is the optical fiber or cable becomes the sensor, and because it's a distributed method, essentially every meter along the length of that fiber can be used as a sensing or detector. So that allows you to create very economically thousands of points of sensing along these long length assets like pipelines. It's a passive sensor. No power is required along the sensor itself. The only power for the sensor is at the interrogator box, which is where the signals are generated and collected. We can monitor, depending on configuration, temperature, strain, and acoustics or vibration. You can also monitor zones along the asset so that you can isolate certain areas and determine where environmental impacts are occurring along the length of an asset very, very precisely. And finally, it's a very upgradable technology. Once you've got the sensor installed along the pipeline, for example, it's relatively easy to upgrade it by changing the interrogator out at the source point. Okay, Chris. So here are some of the key applications that are related specifically to pipeline and oil and gas sensing. Pipeline condition monitoring, this is really important for operators to understand how the assets are running. Pipeline heat trace monitoring is a special application where in pipes that require crude oil to flow and require heating to encourage that, it's important to monitor the temperature profile of the entire length of the pipe. So distributed temperature sensing comes in very handy there. It's also very handy, distributed fiber optic sensing, handy for third-party intrusion detection. So if you're trying to monitor along the asset, you can very quickly pick up on any potential for tampering or trespassing. Geotechnics, as the ground shifts and moves and changes shape, you can utilize DFOS as a means to detect that and report in on it. Transport monitoring, many different transportations. We show a train in this icon, but many different transportations can benefit from the use of distributed sensing. In-well oil and gas monitoring, temperature profiling, vertical seismic profiling can all be done with DFOS. Industrial process monitoring as well, structural health monitoring. If you're looking at dams and so forth, and you're curious about the fatigue of those structures, you can detect fatigue with fiber optic sensing. And then finally, power cable monitoring. If you have an area on the electric grid, transmission cables, for example, where you want to monitor temperature, it's fairly easy to do that with fiber optic sensing. Okay, Chris. So the key benefits as they relate to pipeline are really the DFOS is a very reliable method. There's very little to go wrong with the sensor once it's installed. It's safe. As I mentioned before, it's dielectric. There's no electricity required along the sensing path. It only comes into play really at the interrogator, which is the injection and detection point for the laser energy. It's secured. You can bury it. You can affix it to structures. You can run it aerially. And if anybody attempts to tamper with it, you pick up on those infractions very, very quickly, almost immediately. It's economical from a per point basis. There's really no more economical method to do sensing other than distributed fiber optic sensing over long length systems like pipelines or railways. And it's scalable. You can run multiple fibers in a cable. In parallel, you can run strain sensing and temperature sensing and acoustic sensing and communication. So it's quite flexible in that way. In a very small cross section, very unobtrusive installation, you can apply sensing and perhaps communications to many different assets that you might have. Chris?
Okay, so thank you very much for that introduction, Mike. We're now going to carry on to explain how we can get the data that Mike has illustrated, the strain, the vibration of the temperature from a fiber. So we've got a couple of short technical slides, and then we'll move into looking at some examples from real life as to the types of deployments that can be achieved. So with this animation that you'll see on the right-hand side, we're trying to sort of simulate here in a very graphical and simple way how it works. So we'll have a central location on a pipeline where we would deploy an optical interrogator unit, as we call it, the device that creates the short pulse of light, which is the orange ball that you can see that will go down the pipeline. So it's not an always-on technology. It's a very short duty cycle. We transmit a very short pulse down the pipeline itself. The yellow arrows indicate the data that is scattered back towards the origin by a few processes that I'll explain in the next slide. But this backscatter is generated as the light is passing through the glass, and so at every point in the glass, the light is generating these backscatter signals, which will travel back to the optical interrogator located in the center, where the signals can then be interpreted. And if I replay that, and so these yellow arrows are signifying that backscatter. It keeps going on and the process is repeated. And then what we're after is, if there is a change in circumstances, for example, such as a leak in the pipeline, and that's one of the applications that Mike introduced, then the changes from that event will be seen in the backscatter trace in the fiber itself, and we can notify the operator that there's an event that has happened. And the nature of that event may be acoustic, it may be strain, it may be temperature, and we're going to look in this presentation as to how each of those types of measurement can be influenced or introduced by events on the pipeline itself. The key point out of this is that the passage of this very short pulse of light and the ability to monitor that backscatter signal at all points in real time gives us the ability to precisely locate events with a very high resolution, positional resolution along the pipeline. And by using the three metrics of temperature, strain, and vibration, we're able to infer from those different activities or events that are happening either on the pipeline, in the pipeline, or around the pipeline environment. So how do we extract these signals? So there are the three measurements that we're interested in: the temperature, the strain, and vibration. So if we look down at the bottom of this slide, the dotted red line is our signal. So we launch in a relatively high power signal into the fiber, and we have a few different backscatter mechanisms that give us signals that we can interpret. So the horizontal axis here is just showing wavelength or color, effectively, of the light itself. And if we start from the left-hand side, there's a process known as Raman backscatter, where the color of the light is changed. It's an inelastic scattering mechanism, and it's induced by thermally excited molecules. So the light causes an interaction with them where they change their state of excitation, and we get this signal that propagates backwards towards the origin at a different frequency, different wavelength. And this process is very much dependent on the local temperature. More temperature, more thermally excited molecules, a bigger signal that can then be traveling back. And so from that process, we're able to look at what the temperature may be at any point along the pipeline. The second process that we use is Brillouin backscatter. Again, this is an inelastic technique in that energy is absorbed from the pulse, and so the wavelength of the backscatter is not the same as the wavelength of the original pulse. And this one is slightly different. This is caused by thermally excited vibrations in the glass itself. So whilst the first process, the Raman backscatter, is caused by thermally excited molecules, this is caused by thermally excited vibrations, and this responds to both heat and to strain in the glass fiber itself. And as we apply more heat or more strain, this causes the frequency of the Brillouin backscatter peak to move. And so by looking at the different frequencies, we can infer from that what the magnitude of the change was. They are coupled, so heat and strain will cause a similar shift in signals, but there are ways that we'll talk about that you can extract them independently. These techniques are quite often combined in a single device that will be able to extract both strain and temperature using the same mechanism. The final technique that we're using is DAS, Distributed Acoustic Sensing, and this utilizes Rayleigh backscatter. And this process is an elastic scattering mechanism, and so the scattering peak has the same wavelength as the origin, the same color of light. And essentially what we are doing is scattering off the positions of the molecules themselves, creating a map of where the molecules of the glass happen to be that's unique as the glass is frozen. And these will respond to vibration. There is an aspect of it that responds to strain and temperature, but essentially we're using this to monitor vibration that's going on within the glass itself. The symbol down here where I've noted we have a document, a FOSA document. Part of the remit of the Technology Committee is to publish information to those in industry who are interested in the technology, and you'll find on our website documents that describe each of these techniques. You'll see that crop up later in the presentation as well. And so just to look at the last technical detail on the application, so just repeating the similar sort of approach, this very short pulse of light generating backscatter at each point along the cable. That short pulse creates a very long backscatter tail, so the length of time it takes for the short pulse to get to the end of the fiber is the time between samples, so we can start again as soon as the pulse has left the fiber itself. So we have this long backscatter tail that originates from a very short launch pulse. And if we can zoom in on one particular location, we can see from the pulse is taken that it corresponds to a very narrow distance along the fiber itself, which we can separate up into individual channels just by binning this signal. And if we monitor that, that is essentially the frozen map of the glass molecules characteristically created as the fiber is drawn. And if we go and change that by inducing vibration, we would see that this backscatter pattern at this location would vibrate effectively in accordance with the local environment. And that sort of analog process is common with both strain and temperature. We're just trying to illustrate the technique here rather than the precise details of how it occurs, but sufficient to say that we're able to bin this response up into very small distances, typically 10 meters, 30 feet or so, or less, depending on the application and depending on the technology. But we're able to get thousands of channels of data at very precise resolution relating to temperature, strain, and vibration. We then keep updating that process in real time, and that will help us extract the appropriate data. So that's the short sort of technical introduction to how the technologies originate the data. We'll now move into looking at how these range of technologies can help enhance pipeline safety. And we're going to do that by moving through a few different examples and use cases of taking these individual technologies and applying them to typical problems that we would experience on pipelines. So the first and most obvious application area is enhancing leak detection. And I'm going to look at two different aspects here. The first one is enhancing leak detection with acoustics and strain information. So the icon up here using our DAS information. And then secondly, we'll look at how temperature changes can also be utilized to extract information on leak detection. So the acoustics approach has been quite common, and we see on the right-hand side here a few of the ways in which acoustic information that is related to the presence of a leak can be used to, can be extracted and utilized in an automated leak detection approach. So the first one, and perhaps the most obvious one, is where there is a leak in the pipeline. The fluid, the gas or the liquid that is escaping from the pipeline will create some orifice noise, a typical hissing type of sound. And the characteristics of that will depend on the nature of the product that's in the pipeline. Quite importantly, multi-phase products will act in exactly the same way. And so this gives us a very useful approach for being able to extract mixed phase leak detection from a pipeline. The second approach is to utilize negative pressure pulse. There are standalone monolithic techniques where you apply transducers, pressure transducers, or acoustic transducers individually to the pipeline to look for the pressure pulses that arise when a leak is created, or indeed when valves are actioned. But with the fiber optic sensing, we have the presence of thousands of those transducers sitting alongside the pipeline itself, and we can utilize them to alert both on the presence of a negative pressure pulse arising, but also track it as it moves out along the pipeline. Third approach is to look for the presence of ground heave. So this is feeling the lift of the ground, the escaping gas lifting the ground in a gas pipeline and pushing on the fiber itself. And in a very similar manner for a liquid leak, the fluid pushing on the fiber and creating a signal there. So those four techniques are all very accessible to an acoustic monitoring approach, taking vibration. And we'll look shortly at how the performance of these systems compares to traditional internal systems. So the change here is this is an external leak detection system. The fiber will be outside the pipeline, as opposed to traditional computational pipeline monitoring, where we're using internal measurements. The key is, though, that using these techniques, it allows us to move to more sensitive leaks, more smaller leaks that we're able to pick up by the system, and we're able to pick them up in a much shorter period of time than typically a computational system will be able to deliver. To give a bit of an example, here is some data from a real-life case study of a subsea leak in an umbilical. So the experimental conditions here were with the DAS interrogator units located on the ground. The umbilical was first buried and then came in and out of the seabed a few times, over some rock berms, covered with sand screen, and then running up to the platform itself. The clients knew that there was a leak present because they were not receiving the fluid, so it was quite a catastrophic leak. And the DAS system was being used to try and locate this leak. And this is typical of the sort of trace that would be utilized for that. So left to right, we're looking at distance running along the umbilical from the shore side out to the platform side. And all we're doing is just color coding the intensity of the signal according to the level of sound within a given frequency band, and displaying that as a rolling, we call waterfall display, where when a new sample comes in at the top, one drops out the bottom. So time is running upwards. And we can see as we were starting to fill the umbilical with gas, we see a signature passing along the pipeline until we get to one location when suddenly the noise levels shoot up and continue at that one location and doesn't progress any further. We see some background activity from wave noise, and this is actual waves in the sea, where we're producing some signals, and we can see them moving in towards the shore. But this is the area that we're concentrating on. And if we zoom in, we can see some of the characteristics that I talked about in the previous slide. We can see the orifice noise, and if we zoom in a little bit further, we can start to see that there's a presence of pulses that are moving out along the umbilical itself. And if we zoom right in, because we've got distance and time, we can extract a speed. And the speed of this was pretty much the speed of sound in water. So the inference was that to the left, we have a gas-filled umbilical, as we've been trying to find the leak, and the right-hand side of it is filled with seawater. And at the interface, we're getting lots of orifice noise when the leak hits that location, and lots of negative pressure pulses as you're getting shock waves from the leak products escaping out of in this case, an umbilical, but a very similar approach to take place in a pipeline itself. I mentioned that also we can use temperature effects of a leak product to be able to pick up and identify the presence of a leak along the pipeline. And here we can utilize both detection of cold spots that come from a gas pipeline via Joule-Thomson cooling. So as the gas product escapes out of the pipe, it will cause local cooling, similar approach to which goes on in your fridge in your kitchen. And that cold spot will propagate over time around the pipeline and will at some point come into contact with the fiber and cause cooling there. So if we are monitoring the temperature at each point along the fiber, then we can look for deviations from the normal background temperature and be able to identify that a leak has occurred and the temperature here has somewhat moved away from average. You can similarly use these techniques for heated pipelines where you're looking for a heated liquid rather than a cooling gas signature. But if we couple these with an alarming algorithm to automatically detect these, this can certainly be used to provide an efficient method of leak detection. It may not be as instant as some of the acoustic techniques because we are relying on that cold spot propagating around the pipeline to where the fiber may be. So if you're lucky, your leak is pointing very close to your fiber. Otherwise, you may have to wait. But in general, the propagation will take place in the whole of the surrounding medium. We have another example here from a methane leak. Again, we're just looking at distance along the x-axis, time running vertically, and the color coding here is related to the temperature that is being observed. And in this case, we have a methane leak from a very small pinhole in the pipeline itself, running at fairly low pressure. And under those circumstances, we'd probably expect it to take a fair period of time before the leak would appear. Obviously, for larger leaks or for higher pressures, those temperature changes will take place much more quickly. But this demonstrates the sensitivity of these techniques, able to work at very low leak sizes. So as a comparison to traditional internal solutions, we have a few of the traditional metrics displayed here for both computational systems, up in the dark blue in the top left, and external fiber optic sensing solutions, bottom right. So sensitivity, there have been many industry-led tests on external systems, and in general, the sensitivity is reported as being about an order of magnitude greater than that in a computational system. There's a bit of a balance there because the computational systems are not directly measuring the volume of the escaped leak product, rather it's measuring it as a percentage of flow rate. Whereas our external systems we've talked about will depend on the volume of product escaping out of the pipeline. But in general, there's about an order of magnitude improvement. Similarly with response time, because we're looking at every sensing point continuously, there's again about an order of magnitude improvement in response time as well. Location accuracy, with thousands of sensors covering the whole pipeline, the location accuracy is pretty much unmatchable with any other technique. We're moving from kilometer, mile-based sort of accuracies of positions down to 30 feet or so. CPM systems will tend to be better at measuring leak size. Within fiber optic solutions at the moment, it's tending to concentrate on leak, no leak. There's plenty of scope in the future to improve that analysis and be able to look at leak size. But at the moment, that would generally tend to be an offline calculation. The CPM systems are very reliable. They're very well understood They have a lot of support in the marketplace, whereas the fiber optic solutions are a little bit newer. Confidence is beginning to build, but I think there's still quite a way to go there yet, where we will see more and more systems being utilized, generally in collaboration with the CPM system to achieve the desired results. And similarly, in robustness and versatility, fiber optic sensing has an awful lot to offer, and we're going to look at some of the examples of where we can actually be monitoring dynamic conditions shortly. Moving to strain. So we talked a little bit about vibration and temperature. The similar sort of benefits can come from the strain measurement system. They tend to be utilized where you will have a strain-based impact that you're concerned about. So ground movement for landslides, for example, if we're concerned about subsidence, or we're concerned about soil erosion, anything that could perhaps impact upon the pipeline integrity, a distributed strain sensing solution will have quite a lot to be able to offer the pipeline operator. And as we noticed in some of the earlier slides, the strain sensing solutions will then generally also be able to offer a temperature measurement solution in parallel. And so, as well as monitoring the strain of a slope, for example, that is creeping and pressuring on the cable and creating a strain signal, if we've got anomalies in the soil where they're open and porous and we're allowing liquids in, then we should be able to see a temperature signal there as well. And so these strain systems will be able to help monitor areas that we're concerned about and be able to give a metric over a period of time to be able to monitor the buildup of strain in a pipeline. We've got a couple of examples here. So these are taken from one of our members who's deployed a system onto the Trans-Andean pipeline in Peru, where there are some very serious slopes there, up to around sort of 45 degrees, where there are extensive concerns over soil stability, over erosion, over slope stability. And in the region, about 50% of pipeline accidents or issues on the pipeline will come from that stability oriented issues. And so on the left-hand side there, we can see some examples from the system that were being used to monitor water ingress. So at the bottom chart here, we're looking at position along the pipeline again on the x-axis, and we're looking at the relative temperature along the y-axis. And we can see very clearly that although there is variation as we move along the pipeline, suddenly at one spot, we can see that there has been an anomaly. The different colors are different traces from different periods of time, spanning about 12 or so days. So it's about 2 weeks worth of data, but we notice that at one point, there has a temperature anomaly, and certainly at that location, there is considerably more variation. And if we look in a little bit more detail around that area, we can compare the results from the leak location, or sorry, not the leak location, the thermal event location that had been identified compared to a background neighboring channel that was unaffected. And looking at the region, we see cracks in the soil, we see stability issues, allowing rainfall to percolate down into the soil, interact with the fiber, and create a localized cooling effect. So very helpful in being able to identify anomalous locations. And then similarly, with the prime purpose being landslide measurement, we can very easily see, again, looking along the pipeline on the x-axis, but this time monitoring strain on the y-axis. Over a given range of the pipeline, we see quite an extensive growth in strain, again, over this time a little bit longer, over about 2 months, as there is pressure, as the soil is unstable, beginning to slide down. and we see over that period an increasing strain signal. And so the pipeline operators can use those measurements to inform their decision making as to how they wish to cope with it, or to be able to monitor until a problem reaches a critical level. Right-of-way intrusion detection capabilities. So moving away from sensing an individual metric to looking at sensing activity going on in your right-of-way. These systems, and here we're back to looking at vibrational-based systems, they've been used extensively around the world for many pipeline intrusion detection capabilities, either to prevent accidental damage, but also for more deliberate security activities such as counterterrorism or theft, quite commonly from pipelines themselves. They can be used both as a direct alarming system to raise the warning about the presence of unauthorized activity along the right-of-way, and they can also be used to deliver information on the pattern of life itself. So we've got a couple of videos here. Oh, excuse me. A couple of videos here which we'll play just to illustrate a little bit of that topic. And so it's not confined to operating purely in conventional soil areas. These techniques will also work well even in desert environments. They can be utilized to monitor the presence of vehicular activity, footsteps even, although that generally tends not to be related or be able to be directly related to a threat. But also in the case there, we were alarming against a drilling activity on a simulated part of the pipeline. So dependent on the client's needs, these systems can be tailored towards the threat that is locally present. I mentioned also that we are able to utilize these systems to provide warning to an operator of the presence of theft on a pipeline. So when a client puts a vibrational monitoring system, distributed acoustic sensing in, quite often one of the reasons that they're putting the system in place is to monitor for the presence of someone trying to create a hot tap in a pipeline. And that's quite easy with the right-of-way disturbance activities that we saw on the previous slide. But if you're coming fresh to a project and the client already has unauthorized valves that have been placed into the pipeline, we can also do something to monitor those activities. So this particular case study comes from an example of a refined product pipeline in Mexico, and the client knew from their existing mass balance system that thefts were occurring fairly periodically, following a regular pattern in the middle of the night, maybe about twice a week, where suddenly the pressure would drop, and we would know that over a few cycles, product was being extracted. And what we tended to see here is that for a long period of time, of tens of minutes, product was being extracted, and each one corresponding to about one tanker location. So the client may know that there is unauthorized activity happening, but is fairly powerless to do anything about it other than by inspecting the whole of the right-of-way. But these systems can often be quite well hidden. With the distributed acoustic sensing, however, and the leak detection methodologies that we identified earlier, we're able to see the orifice noise as the valve is opened. We're able to see the negative pressure pulses caused by that product escaping from the pipeline, and they very conveniently point us to the location of the leak itself, or the location of the valve that is being operated. And then it's a simple process for the client to compare the location of valves that we see operating with the valves that they know they already have. And if it's an unauthorized valve, we can then help guide them in to that location to within a few meters, and the follow-on actions can then be up to them. Pig tracking is another case which can be very useful from both an operational context, but also a pipeline safety perspective. If, for example, we have pigs that get stuck in the pipeline, as occasionally happens. So here we are looking at the passage of a pig along a pipeline. It's being tracked with the icon that we see there. And as the pig goes past any of the butt welds in the pipeline, the interference fit of the pig flange with the butt weld creates this double pulse characteristic appearance. You can see over here expanded on the right-hand side. There's a pulse from the front and a pulse from the back of the pig, together with an interference noise as it squeezes down the remainder of the pipeline. And so each of these sections corresponds to a section in pipeline, and over time it will move out in accordance with the flow rate of the fluid in the pipeline. And so this is great for tracking, for time to trap type alarms, just monitoring of the progress of the pig. And of course, if the worst happens and the pig gets stuck, you know exactly where it was. So typically these systems will have forensics built into them to allow you to go back in time and analyze that data. And if you're trying to free it with a pressure imbalance, particularly in a gas pipeline, for example, again, these techniques can be utilized to know how effective they are. In a very similar manner, slack lines, again, characteristic negative pressure pulses that are created from slack line conditions where there may be a great height imbalance in the pipeline itself. These will cause the presence of negative pressure pulses to travel down the pipeline. And you can see here, these are taken from exactly the same location, but just in different days. And you can see that there's a different magnitude of length over which these negative pressure pulses travel down the pipeline. This is about the only technique really that is available to monitor effectively the behavior of slackline conditions, and these can be utilized in a feedback loop if required to then control the back pressure and maintain the slackline negative pressure pulses to a desired level. So moving back into thermal measurements, we've got an example here from pipeline trace heat monitoring, trace heating monitoring. So if we have heavy oil, bitumen, sand, or sulfur, we'll generally have to maintain that fluid at a much higher temperature than the environmental temperature in order to maintain the viscosity of the product in the pipeline and stop it freezing up. Typically, we'll have a double skin approach where we have the core product pipeline in the middle. We will fill the gap between that and the surface with insulation, and we'll then have heat tubes for skin effect heating and a location for the fiber optic itself. And this can be used in a few different ways. It can be used to detect hot spots, which will illustrate overheating, or cold spots, which will either be a blockage or a malfunction or an issue with the insulation. But really, the more general purpose approach is to be able to utilize the absolute temperature data that comes out of the DTS systems to help optimize the heating power. And we have an example here for a sulfur pipeline where the temperatures are maintained at around between 140 and 160 degrees centigrade. And the DTS system that is deployed provides that feedback. We can extract both the whole temperature profile for a point and monitor it over time. We can set alarming to alert to the presence of hot spots, cold spots, or conditions that move away from the nominal. And a very simple display will very clearly display that to the operator. So in terms of the applications, Mike mentioned at the beginning was the multiple modalities. And this can be very beneficial to the user. If we take in this example that I've shown here using a vibration measuring system, we can apply it in different ways at different places along the pipeline. And moreover, we can apply multiple applications at every location. So we may deploy our pig tracking approach everywhere along the pipeline. We may deploy leak detection everywhere. We may only, though, deploy a right-of-way threat detection in areas that we're concerned about. If we're in a real high-threat scenario, we may provide some nighttime alerts to the presence of a stopping vehicle in the vicinity, but maybe not alert on that during the day. Moreover, we can also take exactly the same cable that we're using to run along the pipeline, and at a convenient location, such as a block valve facility or an industrial site, we can spool off a fiber and either bury it to run around the block valve, or possibly put it on the fence and maybe even multiple passes around the facility itself. And at those locations, we may apply some security functions. The point is that Mike made at the beginning is that once you've invested in the presence of the fiber running along the pipeline, the application choice becomes which software suite you wish to deploy at which time for which purpose. And simple extensions such as running around perimeters can then be a very simple loop of fiber without interrupting the main backbone cable running along the pipeline. And different applications can be split out and delivered to different clients, who for them, effectively, they have their own operational or security system and are not bothered about other people's alerts. So how simple is it to get to this, approach? So there are three ways in which to get the fiber onto the pipeline. There is direct burial of cable, there's cable and conduit, and there is retrofit of fiber to existing installations. So the ease of use of direct buried cable and conduit, they're fairly similar. With a direct burial, we'll place an armored cable into the pipeline trench as the pipeline is being laid. The effect of that is that typically the cable is supplied in 5 to 10 kilometer reels, so the lay can be taken into account in accordance with the pipeline itself, and there's a small pause when we need to join segments of cable together. With the cable and conduit approach, instead of laying the fiber down directly, we'll lay a hollow polyethylene conduit along the route of the pipeline, which is just connected together as it progresses, and we can blow a non-armored fiber in afterwards. Retrofit is a little bit harder. It's currently difficult to retrofit fiber onto a pipeline. It is being addressed by both government and industrial R&D funding. It is a hot topic because, of course, particularly within the North American market, there is less fiber that has traditionally been fitted to pipelines in the past, although that's currently being addressed in newer pipelines that are going into the ground. So in terms of cabling itself, there are a few choices of cabling, and again, this is where the association can help potential deploying customers with selecting the most appropriate one. Typically, there are two choices on a major pipeline backbone: an armored cable, which will feature tubes, loose tubes we call them, with fibers embedded in a gel inside. They could be used for communications, and they can also be used for the sensing. And then there'll be a layer of armor in a polyethylene jacket, typically. And these can be direct buried. For the cables that are blown into the conduit, they're a simpler, lighter affair. They're not armored, but essentially the same operating conditions underneath. We have a few other variants, and we have some specialist cables, which are called tight buffer cable, where rather than the fiber being embedded in a gel within its little tube here, they're directly coupled to a polymer coating. And these are then all molded together in a single overlay. These tend to be used for special applications. They can be deployed tactically. But as you can see on this slide here, we're trying to sort of split up where the applications merge onto the technologies themselves. So I mentioned that we have two typical choices of cable: a general backbone cable that is buried and a general backbone cable that is conduited. These are both very robust approaches, and they offer excellent rodent protection. However, you can see the cable attributes may not couple quite as well in all cases to the types of sensing technology that is deployed. There are other cables which may be more appropriate, and so, for example, we may deploy some specialist cables in specialist areas if we have a core activity that we are needing. So, for example, if we're deploying strain sensing over some ranges where we're concerned about the background stability, it may be appropriate there to use a non-standard cable if we are treating it correctly, but that might not be the approach we take to deploy cable along the complete backbone. And again, this is an area where FOSA can help advise. In terms of optimizing the position for the various techniques, it will vary in accordance with the type of technique that is being utilized. Distributed acoustic sensing, so picking up the acoustic signals, either of pipeline leak or right-of-way intrusion, tend to prefer to have the cable in the upper hemisphere of the pipeline. If we're monitoring leak information from the pipeline itself, there's a desire to have it quite close, 1 to 3 feet away, and it can be placed either direct buried or in conduit. For strain sensing, it's more of a specialist application if we're looking at geohazard monitoring, and we may be interested in putting it in different locations. So it will depend on whether it's subsidence or whether it's slope moving, what the actual specifics are in the location itself. For example, if we put one at the bottom, we can pick up sagging. If we put one at the top, we can pick up lateral shift or lift. And then finally, again, with temperature sensing, with DTS, if we're aiming at picking up the information of the leaking product from the pipeline, there's generally a desire to have it very close to the pipeline, ideally coupled for a gas leak application, picking it above the pipeline, and either close to the pipeline or possibly below the pipeline may be an optimum position for picking up liquid leak information. And if we're doing trace heat monitoring, there we're definitely requiring the fiber to be strapped to the pipeline close to the heating element. So a quick summary to complete this part of the talk to the applications and benefits. Mike showed this earlier. So here for information, we're aligning the technologies with the different applications that may be utilized. So for example, distributed temperature sensing, the technology that we would utilize for pipeline heat trace monitoring, distributed strain sensing, soil erosion, subsidence monitoring, and we didn't cover pipeline deformation and hoop strain, but those are equally useful applications. A mixture of technologies that we can deploy for leak detection, and the vibration-based monitoring, looking at right-of-way, geotechnics, and process monitoring. So just to re-emphasize the points, there isn't really any more economical way to monitor lengthy critical assets. There are no competing technologies that can give these great reaches, the very precise resolution, the rapid update time, the ability to know in real time what is taking place along your pipeline, providing you complete situational awareness or knowledge of the circumstances of your asset itself. They're very low maintenance. Once the fiber is put in the ground, it will happily sit there through the life, a long lifetime of the cable itself. This can be used for delivering broadband along the right of way. It can be used to provide the communications backbone for the pipeline. It really is multiple purpose. FOSA is representing the interests of our members who have sensing products or cabling technology. We have, again, separated by our logos for our different sensing technologies, the members who provide content into this talk. The talk itself will be linked to from our website, available on YouTube shortly afterwards as well. So I'm going to hand back to Mike and Mark at this point, but I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen up until now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. That was a great presentation. Mark, did we have any questions coming in? Hello?
Wastewater. Sorry?
It was tough to hear you, Mark. That might have been a mute problem. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, the issue is whether or not it can be used for wastewater facilities, or actually wastewater systems.
So the core techniques themselves, as we've identified, are picking up temperature, strain, and acoustics. Each of the applications will have a dependency on the nature of the product, the pressure, for example, and the diameter, and potentially the flow rate. So fundamentally, these techniques are applicable to any type of pipeline carrying any type of product. So wastewater would be as applicable as an oil-based pipeline.
And I think you covered this briefly in it, but we had a question about the distances that can be covered between over the course of systems.
So those will vary with the individual systems, the individual technologies that will be deployed. And it will also vary with, as we've said earlier in the talk, as to whether they look in both directions or not. Twin head systems are really quite common these days. So in a typical left and right looking deployment of technology, you will generally be able to cover up to around 50 miles from one location. So splitting that half and half, left and right. Some technologies will take you a little bit further. Other technologies may be a little bit more focused in their application because the extent of the signals that we're interested in may be a little bit more precise, such as strain monitoring along a subsidence slope.
Chris, you've talked about a number of the installations around the world. Could you address a little bit about how much this has been deployed in the United States and Canada, and if there are differences in the level of the numbers of installations, what accounts for that?
Yeah, so these types of systems have been deployed very heavily over the last 10 years, and there's a range of types of deployment. One of the publications of FOSA is the global map of installations. And so these will vary from some very localized, precise-based measurements to pipelines that could cover the length of a country. So deployments of over 1,000 kilometers of numerous systems daisy chained together are getting more and more common. Traditionally, there has been a lot of interest in the Europe and the Eastern Hemisphere, where fiber has been more prevalent as the communications backbone of pipeline systems, and so there's been a lot of brownfield activity there, perhaps, let's say, for pipeline theft. But for pretty much every greenfield deployment of pipeline, the benefits of fiber are understood, and it goes in the ground with the pipeline. If we return to Northern America, there has tended to be in the past more of a focus on microwave communication systems, and historically there has been less fiber in the ground with the pipeline, and so there's less of an installed base to be deploying fiber on. But certainly over the last 3 to 5 years, there's been a major industry focus in testing out these systems, understanding the benefits of fiber, and we're beginning to see now the deployment of fiber with new pipelines becoming more and more common.
Next question, I don't know if Mike wants to jump in on this, but a question that has to do with providing a little bit more detail about the economics. I know we said that the installation of fiber optic sensing was economical. Can you provide a little bit more color on that?
Yeah, so the comment about the economical nature of the systems, these DFOS systems, is really related to the fact that they're distributed. So you can turn a fairly low-cost sensor into many sensing points, and if you compare that to traditional systems, the numbers start to bear out. I would like to take this opportunity to let the audience know that FOSA is looking into this question specifically throughout the course of 2018, so that we can come to the market with harder data, stuff that can be viewed and sort of critiqued and made to help the general understanding of how cost effective these systems are. So stay tuned. There's some good information coming down the pipeline, so to speak, and it'll be out probably toward the end of 2018.
And you may want to follow up. I guess one of the trade-offs on this is the potential for insurance costs. Has there been conversation with the insurance industry? Do we expect more? Obviously, currently, pipeline industry experiences some substantial losses. Can this help cut that back?
Yeah, so I think the philosophical case is there to really bring insurance companies into the discussion. And that's another activity that FOSA will be taking on this year. You can imagine if you can monitor a pipeline, for example, and if you're concerned about catastrophic failure in that pipeline or in a railroad, or you pick the long length example, the insurance companies would be motivated to find ways to minimize risks. And of course, that ultimately comes down to the premiums that they might charge for the operators that are operating the system. So yeah, I think there's an opportunity there to bring insurance companies in to help really take advantage of the benefits that distributed fiber optic sensing can provide.
Are there? I'm trying to look at. You've provided some information about applications around the world. You may want to, Mike, provide a little bit more detail about sort of information about how folks can learn more about the availability of the use of fiber optic sensing elsewhere.
Well, I mean, the simplest thing to do would be just to go to the fiber optic sensing .org website, and there's a tab on there that is called Sensing Map, and this is it's kind of an evergreen project. We're going to continue to update this every year, but we have a handy map on there that shows you by country where installations are most prevalent, and then it gets into details as you click around the map to describe the types of installations that are occurring. So it might be a handy resource for anybody interested in learning more about the geographic deployment of these systems.
Sure. And what about the role of government in requiring or in creating standards that would require fiber optic sensing? Is that an issue elsewhere in the world? Is that something that might happen here in the United States?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And it ultimately comes down to safety in greenfield versus brownfield installations. If you have new systems that are being installed, it's relatively easy to add things like distributed fiber optic sensing systems to them as you build. Brownfield installations, however, are a bit more tricky, and in places like the United States, there are thousands of miles of these systems that could be good candidates for DFOS. But actually getting to the installation is tricky. It can be sometimes costly and risky. So we'd like to try to understand how to do a better job of penetrating both greenfield and brownfield. And part of the effort of FOSA is to ask those questions and learn the best ways to do these things and then make recommendations. There is a fairly active effort on behalf of FOSA having to do with public policy. So you can envision teams from FOSA that are going to Capitol Hill, and they're educating legislators as frequently as possible. And then ultimately what we'd like to see happen is bills and laws created that will foster the use of DFOS as a way to enhance safety throughout various industrial systems in the United States and Canada.
Probably have coming up to the top of the hour, and so I have sort of one last question from one of our participants. This really is drilling, no pun intended, but drilling down on the ability of fiber optic sensing to detect the size of a leak. Can you provide more color, and this may be directed, well, either to you or Mike, Chris or Mike, about how much information that the sensing can determine about the scope of the leak, the size of a leak?
Right. I think I'll defer to Chris on that one.
Yeah, certainly. So we've identified a few of the mechanisms that can be utilized to monitor leaks, and certainly some of them will definitely scale with the characteristics of the leak itself. So you can pretty quickly imagine that the orifice noise from a leaking product is going to depend on both the size of the orifice and the pressure of the fluid, liquid or gas, that is in the pipeline itself. Similarly, if they're depending on the size of the temperature change between the product and the background ambient temperature, we may be able to tell you something there, depending on the rate of change, for example, as to some indication of the size of the leak, but that may also depend a little bit on the orientation. There are signals that are present within the various measurement techniques that we can bring to bear. As I mentioned in the comparison slide between internal and external sensing, that's probably the next stage in evolution of these types of measurements, to be able to give an estimate of leak size. At the moment, most of the alarming techniques that are available are leak stroke no leak.
Right. And Chris, a related question, but important question is, this I think came up by one of the audience members, is how small a leak can you detect with these various systems? And I'm sure the answer will vary as well, but I guess the point is you can pick up small leaks and you can pick them up very quickly before they become huge problems. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, so certainly there's been a lot of effort to characterize the abilities of these systems. There's been a number of studies in North America over the last few years to look at how such systems respond to leaks. And part of the focus on that has been trying to drill down to how small can we make a leak before we no longer see the temperature change, it becomes absorbed in the background soil, or we can no longer hear it. The negative pressure pulse tends not to have been something that's been utilized because we need a larger study example for that. But what these have shown, and they've been run by reputable third-party bodies, sponsored by industry, and what these experiments have tended to show is that, as I mentioned, the leak size tends to be about an order of magnitude smaller that can be detected with these techniques, and they can be detected at about an order of magnitude quicker for that small signal. So essentially you bring yourself two advantages when you multiply them together, which is a vastly reduced overall leak volume that has the potential to be detected.
One quick follow-up on that is, what is the minimum location accuracy? How precise can fiber optic sensing be?
So that will vary with a few parameters. It will vary depending on the type of technology that you've deployed, and indeed to some extent with the vendor-specific information as well. But typically the aim over a long stretch, where we may have to think about thousands of channels, is that the delivered accuracy will be around the plus and minus 10 meters. There are lows that take it down to plus or minus a few meters, and there are higher performances that may be plus or minus 30 meters or so. For some of the technologies, such as the temperature sensing, they require a little bit of averaging to get to the precise resolution that you may be after, or the precise change rates that you may be after. And so there are also different techniques that can be deployed in different circumstances. But typically, what has been aimed at with the technology is to be able to direct people to be a location and be in the vicinity of the leak, for example, if that's what we're measuring. And once there, some of the technologies, such as the distributed acoustic sensing, then has the ability to help zone people in a little bit more precisely. If they can make some noise on the surface, for example, just banging with your feet or with a rod, that acoustic disturbance will be picked up by the system, and then they can be guided in a little bit more precisely to the location of the leak itself. And so it definitely reduces the amount of effort that may be required to restitute the pipeline.
But to as close as 5 meters. Well, I think we're past the hour. I will just let folks know that we will be posting this full video on our YouTube page, and also on the which actually is linked off of the fiber optic sensing webpage, so you'll be able to access this or forward this video or this webinar on to others. Next month we will be having another webinar, fiber optic sensing as an Internet of Things application layer. This is from our member company Delos, and it focuses on the perimeter and border security applications, and also the integration of IoT-centric systems. So how fiber optic sensing can be used to tie in with that information. That will be on February 15th, and you can register online at the fiber optic sensing website. Chris, Mike, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. And that concludes our webinar.